Okay, welcome everyone after the lunch. I hope that everybody was getting a coffee and is recovered for the afternoon session. And as Adrien said, we had a spontaneous change in the schedule, and like now Adrien had 15 minutes cut out of the lunch break to prepare a talk to jump in. Thank you so much for this. We are very excited to hear about your work on consciousness research, and that directly hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I wasn't prepared for the honor of donning the Britney Spears microphone, so I thought a little bit about what I could talk about, and there were several options, but in the end, I chose to talk about long-lasting post-diction and the temporal structure of consciousness, because I think that there might be some points of discussion with the talks that we've had earlier on. So, as some of you know, this symposium is sort of happening in parallel to a course we have on consciousness science here. And one of the tasks, one of the exam questions for the students is to summarize one of the talks. So this is a good recap for you, but you can't use this talk to answer the question about the symposium in the exam. Because this is already exam material without the symposium. Anyway, let's get going. So this is some work that I did a few years ago with Michael Herzog and Leila Dressi-Baudi. So I would like to acknowledge their amazing work on these projects. And the topic is kind of, when does consciousness happen? Well, when does consciousness happen? So your brain is constantly and continuously processing things. And you might wonder, at which point do you have a conscious percept of what is being processed? One thing to keep in mind here is that the brain needs to integrate very noisy information all the time. So for example, imagine you're seeing this scene and there's this car here rolling in the dark. Maybe it gets occluded sometimes. The light reflections on the car are changing all the time. So your retina is getting extremely noisy input, and it has to integrate information over time until it comes with a sensible representation. So you cannot perceive stuff instantaneously. Your brain needs to do some sort of disambiguation before the percept kind of makes sense. And one question is, well, how does this happen? There's two big possibilities, broadly speaking. One is that you're continuously having conscious updates, so you're continuously perceiving, let's say, the outcome of the integration. And another one might be that you have only the conscious updates at discrete times. So this is kind of the broad topic I want to talk about. And to talk about it, we're gonna consider the case of post-diction. So post-diction is a type of psychophysical effect where a later stimulus influences the perception of an earlier one. This is a very well-known case called color fusion, and in this paradigm, two colored dots are presented one after the other. First, there is a red dot for a few milliseconds, then a green dot, and the percept is really crystal clear. It's just a yellow dot. So you don't perceive first red, then green. You don't perceive red, then yellow, then green. You perceive just yellow. And this is super clear. When I experienced it the first time on a monitor, I thought that the monitor was a bit buggy and that it was mixing the red and the green, but it was not the case. We had a technician come to check. So there's this very, very strong effect. And it's interesting because in this case, the green dot has to influence the way you perceive the red dot, right? Because you don't perceive first red, then green. You don't perceive first red, then yellow. Again, you just perceive yellow. So it's like if the brain has to wait until the green dot is there to change the way you perceive the red dot and only see a yellow dot. Okay? So this is a post-dictive effect because there's post-diction. The later stimulus changes the way you perceive the first one. And we were working with this sequential meta-contrast paradigm, or SQM. And in this paradigm, it's quite simple. There are a sequence of vertical bars being presented as follows here. And it looks like this. Is it working? Yeah. So you see two bars drifting apart, basically. One interesting thing is that if one of the two bars, for example, if one of the bars, for example, the central one, has an offset like that, you see the offset as being transported along the motion stream, as depicted here. We call these two bars with an offset here a vernier, and this vernier has an offset towards the right. So when I say vernier, that's what I'm referring to. So if one of the vertical bars is a vernier, then you don't see the offset just at one position, you see it as transported along the motion stream. So this can be quantified in experiments. If you ask participants to report the offset direction when you offset the first bar, they are able to do it. They see the offset as transported and they can respond the right direction. If you offset the later bar, the same is true. They can report the direction and it seems to them like the bar is being transported. It becomes interesting when you become a bit post-dictive about it. So what happens if you have two verniers with opposing offsets? Then in that case, the participants are absolutely incapable of reporting the vernier direction. You ask them, report the first vernier, and they just cannot do it. They're at chance level, more or less. Okay? And the corresponding percept is just straight moving bars. If the two verniers are in the same direction, then it becomes very easy again. So the idea is that the first and the second verniers interfere, right? You only see the integrated percept and not the first vernier independently from the second one. So it's as if the brain has to wait until the second vernier appears to decide whether to perceive this with the straight bar or that with the offset bar, right? So the difference between these two stimuli comes late, comes 130 milliseconds after the target, yet you only perceive the integrated percept, so it's a long, quite a long post-dictive effect. Does that make sense? So before I started working on this project, there had been some previous work. Otto and colleagues had shown this post-diction effect that I just showed to you, and we wanted to know how long it lasts, and we also wanted to know if it's mandatory or if subjects can break it when they know about the whole paradigm. So we did the obvious thing. We made a very long stream with bars, and we had always a vernier in the first location, and then we presented a vernier in the opposing direction later on. And we explained everything to the participants. We were like, there's going to be a stream of bars, and the first one will be offset. There will be another one later on, and you have to ignore that. You just have to report to us the first vernier here in the beginning. And what we did is that first we reproduced the Otto et al. Result with 130 milliseconds delay, but then we presented the second offset later and later and later. And basically we wanted to know how far can the second vernier be from the first so that you only see the integrated percept and not each element in isolation. And I will skip the results because we're going to go in detail with results a bit later. But right now, with this experiment, what we found is that the integration is mandatory in the sense that the participants cannot report the first vernier up to 450 milliseconds for half of the observers, and for the other half, at least 290. So for each observers, there seems to be sort of a cutoff where if you go longer, they can report both of them independently, but if it's shorter than that, they can't. Yeah.
Is it also possible they don't have to tell the reporting first video and then rather than the reporting second video, just produce down?
Well, we told them that it's always the first, to focus on the first, and we had conditions where everything was counterbalanced. It's been a long time now. Well, later on, I have an experiment later on where we ask them to report the second one and they can do it. So I don't think that's what's happening. Cool. So in other words, yeah.
There are chance that the subject.
Yes. Yes.
So each subject is a chance. So it's not the case that there are chance when you average the cross subject. That's the important point.
Well, even if they think that there is chance for something, it could be that it happens.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah. So for this, let's wait until we have the second condition. Yes, where was I? Perfect. Let's discuss, I'm sort of freestyling, so interrupt me as often as you want. Okay. So this kind of shows that post-diction can last up to 450 milliseconds. Perception seems to wait as long as 450 milliseconds. And this is a large qualitative effect on discrimination. So it's not a tiny effect with a small effect size. It's not about detection. It's like you're focusing your attention on the center of the screen. There will be a value there in the fovea. It should be a very strong signal. And still, if they are 290 milliseconds apart, then you're at chance level. If there is just the value, you can easily do it. You're at 75% correct because that's how we calibrated. So it is big qualitative drop. Okay, so this is evidence for very long-lasting post-diction. You can have two visual stimuli separated by hundreds of milliseconds, and you don't perceive them individually, you only perceive the outcome of integration. There is some converging evidence from other groups for long-lasting post-diction, and this is nice because it's work by the lab of Claire Sergent, who is sick and cannot give the talk now, so I don't know what she was going to talk about, maybe something about this. So let me take you through what they did very briefly. There's a there's a target, which is oriented grating, like this, and it can be presented to the left or to the right. Then there is ISI, which can be hundreds of milliseconds long. And then there is a cue that says, now focus here, focus your attention on this location. And if the cue is valid, if it's on the side of the screen where the target was, then this sort of retroactively allows the subject to see the value. If the cue is on the wrong side, then they cannot do it. Okay, so a cue presented hundreds of milliseconds after the stimulus can post-dictively make the stimulus conscious, so to speak. This is another long-lasting post-dictive effect. Here is another example. It's again with verniers, but now there's just two of them. One is like this, the second one is like that. And just as when you present red then green, you see yellow. If you do left vernier, right vernier, you see aligned vernier, and you can't report the opposite direction of the first one. So what the Charnowski et al. Did was to do this, and then at various times after the stimulus ended, they administered a TMS pulse over, I forgot which brain region now, because it was too long ago, but they administered a TMS pulse over visual cortex somewhere. V1. V1, thank you. And you can see that the TMS pulse impacts the reported offset direction for around 300, 400 milliseconds too. So this is sort of an external stimulation. It's not just a visual stimulation, it's imposed with TMS, but it's the same idea. Inputs to the brain over hundreds of milliseconds are processed together, and you have to take all of this 300-ish milliseconds into account if you want to know what the person will perceive. One last example used visual masking. So there was a target, here it's a 6, and then there was a mask with a variable delay. And sometimes the participants see the 6 and they can report it, and sometimes they don't see it, and they report whether they saw it or not. And the main point here is that for 250-ish milliseconds, the brain activity looks similar if they saw the stimulus or if they didn't. And the difference between seen and unseen only comes later. So all this shows that there exists long-lasting post-diction. This shows that the perception of the first element can depend on the second element presented hundreds of milliseconds later. And it's important to note that during this time, the first element is represented, right? We know it's there in the brain since it's influencing the post-dictive percept, but it's not perceived. You cannot report it independently. You don't see it. So conscious perception seems to wait for hundreds of milliseconds. And we have convergence evidence for this from different paradigms. So now let's spend the remainder of the talk thinking about what this tells us about consciousness. It helps us think about whether consciousness is updated continuously or discretely. In fact, this post-dictive effect is a challenge for theories that think that you have continuous updates to your conscious content. Why? Well, because if you had a continuously sliding window, right, that sort of you constantly perceive the outcome of integration in the past few hundred milliseconds, you would definitely see first, I have to wait till this is out of the way, First, only the green dot is in the integration window, so you see green, then you would see yellow, and then you would see red. But this is not what happens. You only see yellow. This is a very strong, striking effect. So it seems unlikely that you're continuously updating your conscious percept. We call this the too many percepts problem, right? Continuous theories cannot explain why you don't perceive first the first stimulus and then the integrated stimulus and then the last stimulus. So they predict too many percepts. So Diction proposes a problem to continuous theories and favors discrete theories of conscious updates. Right. There are also discrete theories that exist. For example, Van Rullen has a discrete theory, or global workspace theory can be seen as a discrete theory. One quite influential idea is that you have these oscillations in the brain, and everything that happens between two peaks of the oscillation is sort of bundled together. So the idea is, if you have red and green within one oscillation, then you will see yellow. That's the idea. So then, let's assume that a discrete theory, a bit like this, is correct. Then, how long should these time windows of integration last? Let's try and figure out the duration of these time windows. So one thing we did for this was to now present 3 Verniers in the stream. We estimated that the size of one window is 300, 400-ish milliseconds from our previous results. And the idea is, if these 2 Verniers here are in the same window, even though they're far apart, they should be integrated. These 2 here are not in the same window, so even though they're closer together, they should be reportable separately, okay? So basically, the hypothesis is, well, what we're trying to test is, how close can these 2 Verniers be? How far can these be so that they are not reportable independently? And how close can these be so that they are reportable independently? That's kind of the idea. So here are some results, right? I'm showing on the y-axis the dominance level. Basically, if it's 75%, it means that you report the blue offset correctly 75% of the time, and that's how we calibrate it. We calibrate the offset size so that people report it correctly 75% of the time. And if the dominance is more towards the red, basically it means you're reporting the correct value here. You're reporting this later value in the opposite direction, 75% of the time. So these first 3 bars show you that when there's just one value in the stream, you can report it super easily. Next, we reproduce the results from last time. So we have the first Vernier and the second Vernier, and we ask them to report the second one this time instead of the first one. And they are at chance level when they are within the first integration window. And when they are in different time windows, when they're further apart, then you can super easily report the second Vernier. So there's this discrete switch like before. If they are far enough apart, you can easily report the second one. And then we had all 3, and the question is, what integrates with what? Okay, so we tell them first, there are 3 Verniers, report the first one, and then there are 3 Verniers, report the last one. And when we ask them to report the first one, they cannot do it, so this one gets sort of entangled with this one. But when we ask them to report the last one, they can do it easily. So this one is not integrated with this one, even though they're closer together in space and time. And then Leila Daudi went crazy and did zillions of conditions with Verniers everywhere, up to 6 Verniers and up to 717 milliseconds. And it was a nightmare to control everything, but she did amazing work. And basically, she showed that what matters to know which Verniers end up mixed with which other ones is just which ones are in the same 450-ish time window. So all of this gets integrated and all of that gets integrated, but this doesn't get integrated with that. And I will skip all the details because it would be way too long and because, to be honest, I kind of forgot. So the idea is that there are long discrete time windows of unconscious processing. So your brain is registering each of these individual stimuli and integrating them and trying to come up with the best explanation of what just happened. So it says, oh, I have noisy inputs. Sometimes the bars are like this, sometimes they're like that, but overall there is moving, there are moving bars, and if I integrate information over all of this, it seems like it was just straight bars. So you perceive straight bars. Then a second window, discrete time window opens, and the same process happens, and in this, the evidence is towards the left, so you perceive leftward offsets. So, yeah, I think I will skip this for the sake of time. Or, no, I won't skip it. So up to now, I argued that this too many percepts problem favors discrete theories, and we find direct evidence that there are very long-lasting 400-ish milliseconds discrete time windows of perception. But there's one remaining problem, which is that discrete theories face a problem of their own, and that is that they need to have the right timescale. So before I argued that with this color fusion example, for instance, discrete theories are fine because first the discrete window is here. You actually see my mouse? Oh, no, you don't. All this time. So discrete theories are fine because first the integration window has no dots in it. Then the integration window moves to the next discrete time. So now you have red and green in the same window, and you integrate it and you see a yellow dot, and then you see nothing. So you're not predicting too many percepts. But if the discrete time windows are too short, then you still struggle. Or if they are too long, it doesn't work either. So you need your discrete sampling, discrete updates to be on the right time scale. And this is weird because we know that the temporal resolution in different paradigms changes very strongly. So for example, you can detect apparent motion if the two stimuli are 3 milliseconds apart, and this can go all the way to 400 milliseconds temporal resolution in the SQM that I just showed you. So there's no consistent sort of duration for discrete percepts. How can we resolve this conundrum? Well, the idea is that, yeah, I'll skip this. So this is the same thing I just said before. Excuse me for the chaos. I haven't given this talk in a long time. This is the same idea I just mentioned before. So we can resolve consciously different timescales and different paradigms from very short stuff to very long stuff. And that's a problem because it's not clear which temporal frequency you need to update your discrete percept at. That's kind of the idea. And so the solution, we think, is that there are two stages in perception. The first stage is unconscious and very precise, and it can capture all of the different stimuli that are shown to you and analyze them and represent them and keep them in mind. And this is all happening unconsciously. And then at a very slow rate, every 300 to 400 milliseconds, the consciousness is being updated as the outcome of all of this unconscious processing. So again, you have continuous unconscious processing that analyzes lots of stuff all the time, and then every 300 to 400 milliseconds, you update your conscious percept based on this information. So the idea is if you're doing if you're doing color fusion, your brain will register the red dot, register the green dot, put it together into a yellow dot, and then after 300 milliseconds, you perceive that. And the post-queuing paradigm that Carl Sergent developed, you will see the very faint cue, you will register it, then later on, a faint target, you will register it, it's represented in your brain. Later on, there is a cue, and then the outcome of all of this is your brain is like, yeah, I should perceive the target. After 300 or 400 milliseconds, this happens. And the SQM is what I already mentioned. So your brain is registering each element in the stimulus and coming up with sort of the best explanation of what happened in the previous 300 to 400 milliseconds. And so if there was a value like this and a value like that, you perceive a straight bar. If there was just a value like this, you perceive an offset, and so on and so forth. So take-homes are that there seem to be long-lasting windows of complex and conscious processing. that the SQM, sequential meta-contrast masking paradigm, the one I was talking about all along, provides direct evidence that these windows are discrete in time. And to propose these results, we propose that conscious perception may have a two-stage temporal structure with continuous and precise unconscious processing, followed by discrete conscious updates. And this solves both the too many percepts problem of continuous theories and the problem that discrete theories need to have the right temporal resolution. I'm almost done. There's a few surprising implications of this idea. Imagine that you're playing tennis with Coco Gauff and you have to return a serve that she sends. The ball should arrive around 340 milliseconds after she hits it, assuming a 200 kilometers per hour serve, which I think she can do. So if consciousness really is discretely updated every 450 milliseconds, then you cannot hit the ball based on conscious information. Your consciousness happens after you've actually returned the serve. And this suggests that in many cases, like this one, you react based on unconscious processing. And you only become conscious of the ball coming towards you after you actually returned it. This seems weird, but at the same time, it's not so weird. It's well known that you can do complex actions unconsciously. For example, the famous patient DF with lesions to the ventral stream could unconsciously guide her actions. So if you asked her, what is the orientation of this hole, this slot, she would not be able to respond. But if you ask her to put this object through the slot, then she could do that very easily. So this is an example showing that you can do pretty complex actions unconsciously. So altogether, we discussed that there's converging evidence for long and discrete time windows of complex unconscious processing, and that there is some evidence for a two-stage model with continuous and precise unconscious processing followed by discrete conscious updates. And an implication of this is that we can perform complex actions unconsciously. I think there might be some interesting points of discussion with the two talks we saw this morning. For example, related to imagery, is there a posdictive component to imagery? How would that work? Could it be that the reality monitoring system only samples very infrequently, and that could be why you update percepts infrequently? Open question. Regarding the talk by Matthew, it seems that a lot of processing, including complicated top-down integration processes, can happen unconsciously based on these results. So I wonder if this challenges the dendritic integration theory. So these are just topics we could discuss. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Questions?
You could just tell, I'm always fascinated by your ICD results because that's what I'm here.
Yeah.
So cool. So I just wanted to say some random words about your this question for you. I think it's interesting. I mean, there's some theories that you say that the perceptual reality monitoring is the thing that guides things into conscious experience. What do you think? Do you think that makes sense?
So do I think that when the reality monitor says this is legit, you're conscious of it? No, I think that's too simple. I would be willing to buy that it's one ingredient that is important. Like maybe it's necessary for the brain to actually entertain the possibility of making this conscious. But so then it would still work like if this happens slowly and then there's more downstream stuff that's also relevant, then that could be the reason why it's slow. Yeah.
I have a question and a follow-up question. The first one is, what exactly do you mean by continuous versus discreteness of consciousness? So when does it happen? It seems like you're talking about, or at least one thing that I would think is that for every moment in which you're conscious, there's another moment between them in which you're also conscious. Continuous now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I mean is your brain is continuously, constantly changing its representations, right? There's recurrent processing, everything is continuously changing over time. And the question is, how often does your conscious percept sort of get updated based on this ongoing information? So one possibility is that you're always conscious, like as soon as you have a slight change in representation in your visual cortices, that impacts your perception. So that would be a continuous sort of theory, continuous updates to your conscious percept. A discrete theory would be there's substantial sort of evolution of your visual processing, and you're only updating your conscious perception later at the end of this. So a discrete theory would say something like, imagine a ship, the captain of the ship only wants sporadically to know what's going on in the engine. There's people working in the engine all the time, and they only send information every so often to the captain.
Okay, so it seems like you have, you're saying there's a constant change or update of representational information in consciousness. That's what makes it continuously discrete. I guess part of what I was interested in, it seems like some people read these sorts of experiments as saying that, like, there is a moment in which we are conscious, so when the conscious happens, and then there's the unconscious period in between them, in which we're not conscious. Yeah, and that would be one way to think about it. But I think that at least that doesn't necessarily follow from these sorts of experiments, which only show that consciousness is discrete with respect to external perceptual information. So in principle, if consciousness takes time to occur or something like that, we could have consciousness throughout the windows, but just the representational information gets updated, even though consciousness itself is a process, and every time it is occurring. So I think that's
I actually, that's closer to what I believe.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
my point is really, there's lots of stuff going in your sensory cortices, and you're just not conscious of that as it happens. Instead, like the captain says, what's happened in the last 400 milliseconds, they get an update, and then that, like, your consciousness itself can have no gaps, but like you update the information at discrete time.
Yeah.
So looking at the time scale, 150 milliseconds for a couple of reasons. I'm not a big CEG person or a trainer person, but that looks a lot like when the feedback sweep arrives in the cortex. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's
But
150-ish.
So it's at least the order of magnitude, right? And what I'm asking myself is that what's happening, or where does that time frame come from? Because could that be that there's this kind of time dependence conscious from the moment the sweep starts, right? Like the first symbol starts the sweep and then it comes back. So that if in your experiment you would have actually a pre-stimulus prior to your actual manipulation, that would start an earlier sweep, you could actually shift the time window before the experiment and then kind of have the integration with something.
Yeah,
Have you tried that?
that's a good question. Our idea is that the time scale kind of comes from the typical duration of a fixation. The brain is, so we move our eyes roughly 3 times per second under naturalistic conditions. And so one hypothesis would be that's where this time scale comes from. Usually you integrate information over that length-ish. So then sort of, yeah, there's a link between these things. I think my understanding is that recurrent processing sort of kicks in earlier than 300 milliseconds, more around 150. So yeah, but one thing we did do is try to start the stream, like, so you first have a flash and then you start the stream and it opens. And so actually, interestingly, that doesn't shift everything. So you always start at the beginning of the stream to you open the window. So I think the idea is what is happening is the brain is sort of creating groups, perceptual groups, and it's saying, when does this group start? And if the flash is too unrelated to the stimulus, then they don't get combined, they don't get integrated.
So you could say consciousness is something that's object dependent almost.
Yeah, I guess. conscious, like the update and conscious information depends on object groupings. Yeah.
That was really fascinating. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, kind of puzzle. Let's say it takes 50 milliseconds to get to V1, another 80 milliseconds to get to VOC. We're at 130 milliseconds at that point. We'll add in another 100 milliseconds for my colleague loop to come back around. Now I'm only, what, 230, 240 milliseconds? What biophysically is determining this like 400 millisecond process? That's an eternity. Right?
Yeah, it's so long. I agree. It's not clear to us. We did do some, I didn't, but some follow-up work with EEG, and they do find like a sort of shift in the EEG trajectories of how the first object is represented around 300 to 400 milliseconds. So there seems to be something physiological going on, but it's not clear exactly what it would be. One simplistic, but I think not very plausible option would be there's just a rhythmic, well, not really rhythmic, but like you open a window of integration, there's a timer, then it closes afterwards. I think that seems weirdly discrete for biological systems. Another thing could be you wait until the information stabilizes to some extent, like sort of an attractive thing going on. But yeah, we haven't cracked that question yet.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I can't disentangle this complexity. It's fantastic to be confronted with that. I'm just wondering if it helps to put a few cards on the table. It was the leave it to other people to play with. The thing we imagine with the processes going on in the second balance is that this is preceding, this is like something you might have thought of as a gist or something that's something that you're not actually is in your focus of attention, but is that you know is influence. You've still got some control, let's say. You're pushing yourself in one direction and not avoiding the brain.
How fast does this happen? What you described with layer 6B?
Well, the effects, if you mean the hit, it's how fast can you influence what you do.
Yeah.
It's 5 to 10 milliseconds.
Oh, wow.
So, but what's interesting in a sense is that there's some facilitation going on, not, so there's a very long-lasting component of this. So in terms of pre and post diction, there's a component of this that has to be present for it to facilitate the engagement of something that it's a machine that lasts after that makes it more likely to come back to that at some point. None of that presumably is being directly accessed in the sense that it's what one would imagine would be experienced. It's sort of stored in the system.
Yeah.
And we have to separate from working memory or something that is on the verge of being accessed, both before and after the events that actually are received. So as I said, it doesn't feel like that's the answer to what you're saying, but it feels like it should be in the discussion.
Yeah, so one possibility is that all of this is an important part. I guess it goes back to what Matthias asked earlier. So is all this sort of thalamocortical loopy stuff a signature of processing versus near processing, or a signature of conscious processing versus unconscious processing? So these are two possible accounts. One sort of trivial account in which this could play a role in the results I described is if it's sort of just part of processing. And so this has to happen, and it happens, and then there's a discrete update that depends on what has happened in these loops. Like these loops sort of set the stage. They are taking part in building the percept, and the percept gets consciously updated later. That would be one possibility.
Thank you. You already kind of answered one of my questions, but this reminded me of this work by Eilert Landau about attention sampling information from proto-visual stream sequentially every like 250 to 300 milliseconds, I think. So this first threshold, 219 milliseconds, that we found in most people, I think corresponds to what I keep seeing over and over, corresponds to the saccade rhythm and so on. So it seems like this is a low window. Then it's a bit surprising that when you reset the window, you don't see any difference in your case, where you try to like do a flash to open a window.
Yeah.
And it did not find any weird effects. So you could, open a window and then start presenting the vernier at the end of the window and see whether this helps something escape. Because you should be able to somehow match,
To shift the window.
to shift the window. Exactly.
Yeah, but I guess this is possible if you use the right window opening key. But just a flash, I mean, let me try one thing. Just a flash is not the right key, but I would guess that it's possible to do
Yeah.
that.
And the other thing to say is sometimes I think it happens that you have situations that you have a person that explicitly requires temporal integration. And this is a person that explicitly requires temporal integration. Does this mean that this is what's happening when you have a person that doesn't require temporal integration, when you have a stable image of a face?
Yeah.
It's a bit hard to extrapolate in these situations. You might be pushing the visual system into waiting,
Yeah,
or otherwise you wouldn't necessarily have to be waiting.
that's true. And that's really, 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 really hard to address. So one thing I can tell you for sure is if you flash the first value, then there's nothing, and then you flash the second value in the periphery, they are super easy to report, both of them. So they have to be sort of bound by the intervening streams. And our idea is, our idea is the brain needs to know that there will be intervening streams so that it doesn't perceive the first value first. So basically you're saying after the fact, you can say, I know that now this required temporal integration. So after the fact, it's easy to say this required temporal integration, this didn't. But when you see the first stimulus, when it's presented, the brain doesn't know if it will require temporal information. Temporal integration. And that's why we say that it's likely that even in these cases, there's at least some substantial window that opens.
Pushing for the apart in two verniers.
How far?
Yeah, so the brain can know if something happens within the next 10 minutes, but if nothing happens within the next 15 minutes,
Yeah.
it's hard.
Yes, so we have not tried that. So what I do know is the exact temporal and spatial distance between the bars is somewhat flexible. Like you can do 5 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, this kind of works. But at some point, actually, you can feel it. Instead of seeing moving bars, you see, and then that stops working. But this is more anecdotal, and we haven't had a sort of very precise way of measuring it. So it's possible that if the brain decides, yeah, no temporal integration, the window closes early. That's possible.
Great, I mean, just touching the format of time, maybe just one more question.
Yeah, fantastic talk. I'm just wondering whether like there is like this kind of like temporal spatial integration is not always going on. Why not referring to some kind of like prior information comes off first? I guess also like a very interesting like a post-fiction phenomenon like the headline of the way like this famous rebel. And people have now started avoiding this with a Bayesian, quite simple Bayesian spatial temporal integration model, and it fits nicely to the data. So I'm wondering whether you really need like a SP3 update, or you can say, okay, there are some kind of like priors or different kind of features like where some kind of like temporal integration can be learned. These kind of like very artificial kind of stimuli in the lab, yeah? People, there it becomes to like that is becoming very interesting, and the illusion where is there in natural all the time. Also,
Yeah. Well, that would be one theory what takes 300 milliseconds? So we had a question before, what takes so long? And one possibility would be to terminate this Bayesian process. And our claim then would simply be, you don't perceive anything until it's finished. Right? So, but for the Bayesian process, you still need to have feature detectors saying, I was touched here, so that's represented, but you don't feel it yet, and then, you know, this same sort of argument still flows. It's just a Bayesian mechanism explaining how it's resolved.
I'm not 100% sure. There's like some kind of like hierarchical updating going on, information processing, where like the process is going on without holding some kind of like information unconsciously, but it's like a terms like in neural net, so it's a kind of a method that's kind of algorithm until it converges.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's a sensible way to think of these results, thinking like there's some process going on, and when it converges, you perceive the outcome of the convergence. Then it seems to me that the first value is still part of this convergence, like it's still represented, and you don't perceive it, you only perceive the outcome of the convergence.